Welcome back to Chapter 6, where we are talking about the integumentary system. Last video, we ended up discussing the hair follicles. So I want to go ahead and recap these images for you just so that we can get a quick overview of what we talked about, or some of the things we talked about while we were talking about hair follicles or integumentary system and the hair. So remember that this layer on the image on the left, this top layer of this image, this is the epidermal layer. So you have the stratified squamous epithelial cells that are alive here. You push them up toward the surface, and then you get to the the stratum corneum layer. So the deepest layer of epithelium is the stratum basale, and deep to that is the basement membrane. Then you go up from the stratum basale to the stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, and if this happens to be thick skin, you have the stratum lucidum, then you'll have the stratum corneum. All right, so all of those are parts of the epidermal layer. Deep to the epidermal layer, you have the dermis. Remember that the dermis contains all the structures. So you have your blood supply, so your arteries and veins. You have your sweat glands associated with it. And remember that sweat glands are exocrine glands. So being that it's an exocrine gland, it's going to have a duct that leads to a surface. And in this case, those surfaces are what we tend to call pores. So that the duct is leading directly to that surface through a pore or through a duct that empties into a pore. You have apocrine glands. So this are miracrine. This is an example of miracrine glands. It's an example of apocrine glands. Same idea. Opens into a duct that leads into onto the surface of the skin. You have sebaceous glands that are directly connected to your hair follicles. This is how hair gets so oily, because the sebaceous glands basically open into the hair shaft or the hair follicle through a duct, and that leads to the surface. Remember that around your hair follicles, you have epidermal tissue, because the follicles are produced from the superficial to the deep, and then it pushes out from the epidermal layer down into the dermis. So this whole follicle is surrounded by epithelial tissue, even though it's deep in the dermis. You have in here, you also have nerves, you have nerve endings, and deep to that, you start getting more and more adipose tissue as you move into the uh, subcutaneous layer. So let's talk about hair loss. Now, I know this is one of the clinical applications, but this clinical application is important enough, I believe, for you all to know it, to learn it, to understand it. So hair loss can be caused by many, many different reasons. It can be caused by lack of nutrients. Basically, your body is not able to keep up with the demands of making the hair, and it shifts those nutrients to other places. You often see this in like pregnancy. So when a woman's body is building a baby, sometimes if she doesn't have enough nutrients on board, the baby will get the nutrients and she won't. And so, like, one of the things that can happen is her hair starts to fall out. Um, There's pattern baldness as someone gets older. That's more of a genetic thing. And there's bald patterns on different parts of the head. So the most common type of baldness is going to be that pattern baldness, especially with the top of the, with loss of the hair at the top of the head. That is called androgenic alopecia. Alopecia is the term that refers to the hair loss. Androgenic is basically talking about why it's happening. So an androgen is a male sex hormone. It refers to male sex hormones. And in this case, we're talking about, of course, testosterone and all of the other male sex hormones associated with it. Even though we commonly only talk about testosterone, there are more than one. Typically, this type of hair loss or hair loss in general is going to be associated with lowered levels of testosterone or lowered levels of estrogen. So, for many women, once they enter into menopause, so they get older and they enter into menopause where the hormone levels start to drop, they'll start to experience alopecia in those cases as well. Progenitor cells are lacking in the bald spots, but stem cells are present. So progenitor cells, meaning those hair cells, those precursor hair cells, um, are lacking where you have bald spots, but there are stem cells. So the person's hair, like the hair making cells are not there, but cells that can become anything tend to be there. You just have a disconnect in, you know, the cells and actually making the hair. Then there's another type of alopecia. So remember, alopecia refers to the hair loss. Alopecia areata, which is different from androgenic alopecia. In alopecia areata, the body produces antibodies that attack the hair follicles. So this is going to be an autoimmune disease. So the body stops seeing the hair follicles as its own self, starts looking at it as a foreign invader, and because it sees it as a foreign invader, it attacks it because we don't want foreign invaders in the area. So these are two types of hair loss: androgenic alopecia, which has to do with hormone levels, and then alopecia areata, which is an autoimmune disease. All right. So when we're talking about glands of the skin, remember this is an exocrine gland. These are exocrine glands. This one in particular is about the sebaceous gland. When we say sebaceous, sebaceous means pertaining to sebum. Sebum is the oil produced by the skin, the oil produced by the skin. All right. So remember, sebum or sebaceous glands are holocrine glands. And so going back, I don't remember how far back, so I may not be able to go back all the way. Oh, well, there you go. I missed it. Oh, no, that was in the other PowerPoint. Okay. So in chapter 5, we were talking about the different types of glands, and I wanted to just have that up while we're talking, but since it's not there, we'll keep moving. So holocrine glands. Holocrine glands are the ones that secrete the entire cell. And then as the cell with the product is moving toward the surface, the cell degrades and releases the product. All right, so holocrine gland. It's usually associated with hair follicles. So some people have oilier hair than others because the integumentary system, the sebaceous glands of the integumentary system are producing oil. They may be producing more oil, and because that oil, uh, most of the times those oil glands empty out into the hair follicles, the hair itself becomes oily. Sebum keeps hair and skin soft and waterproof. So part of the reason why our skin produces oil is to keep our hair soft, to keep our skin soft. This is why when we are dry, putting some type of oil or butter or something like that on the skin or lotion helps keep it soft and waterproof, because that's what our body technically does on its own, but sometimes it cannot keep up with the demands. If a person has excess sebum, it may cause acne, especially if those sebaceous glands get blocked, then you have even worse acne. But sebaceous glands are absent on your palms and soles. So in those places where you have really thick skin, you do not have sebaceous glands. So in this image, before I start pointing structures out, what I want to remind you of is whenever you are looking at images under a microscope or pictures of microscope images, remember that it's not always going to look exactly the way you want to, because the body is in 3D. Everything is moving, is in different orientations at the time, and depending on how that specimen is sliced, that will determine what the structures look like. So here we have a hair follicle, but you don't see a hair in the same way that you saw one in the previous picture. But this is the hair follicle. This is a hair follicle. And here would be the bulb. This would be the cells that are actively producing the hair. Like these also would be the cells actively producing the hair. This that is next to or adjacent to the hair follicle, those are the cells of the sebaceous glands. Remember the sebaceous glands, this is also sebaceous gland. Sebaceous glands are going to sit near the hair follicle, and it's oftentimes going to empty into the hair follicle so that it's using that same space, that same pore, to exit the body as the hair is using to exit the body. So these cells are sebaceous glands, and these are hair follicles next to those sebaceous glands. And these are those cells that are producing the hairs. All right. So now acne. Acne vulgaris is a disorder of the sebaceous glands. So remember that your sebaceous glands open up, most of the time, open up into hair follicles, and they produce oil. Some produce more oil than others, and that oil escapes through that pore that the hair follicle is coming out of to go to the surface of the skin. If there is a problem with the production of oil or with the glands itself, then you get acne. So acne vulgaris, there are many different types of acne, but acne vulgaris is very common at puberty. This is why when people start turning 8, 9, 10, especially like 11, 12 years old or so, that they start to develop acne because of the hormones that are starting to increase but have not yet stabilized. So common at puberty because sebaceous glands are excessively responsive to the androgens. The sebaceous glands become clogged with extra sebum and epithelial cells. So you're producing more sebum than you were before. The sebum and the epithelial cells get mixed up, get clogged up, get um, it starts to accumulate and it clogs those pores, but the underneath cells are still producing the product. And so it is backing up underneath the skin, even though it can't leave the skin. Clogged glands provide a good environment for anaerobic bacteria, and that infection will then cause inflammation. So those clogged pores are, a nice, warm, food-filled space for bacteria, especially anaerobic bacteria, bacteria that don't like oxygen. And because they'll be eating and reproducing. The skin, the cells associated with the skin will try to fight it. And that's that inflammation that's caused by the clogged pores that leads to acne vulgaris. About 80% of people that are between the ages of 11 and 30 can have acne vulgaris. Commonly, it is treated with vitamin A derivatives. You can treat it with antibiotics, salicylic acid, so that is the same type of acid that is in things like aspirin, and then benzoyl peroxide. All right, let's talk about the sweat glands. So sweat glands, you'll find sweat glands throughout the entirety of the skin. All the skin has some type of sweat glands or another. Sweat glands will originate in the deeper part of the dermis or even in the hypodermis. They're ball-shaped coils. So you have basically a long, long tube that is coiled on top of itself to create a ball. Going back a few images. So here you see this is a coil-shaped ball that is a tube coiled on top of itself. And then the other end of that tube is what creates the duct that leads toward the surface. Same here with this gland. Coil-shaped ball or a tube that's coiled on itself. And then one half of the tube or the other side of the tube is considered the duct that leads out toward the surface. There are three types of, or several types of sweat glands. You have eccrine sweat glands, apocrine sweat glands, and then you have those specialized sweat glands. Eccrine sweat glands are your merocrine sweat glands. So please do know both terms, eccrine and merocrine. These are the most numerous. These will produce sweat that is mostly water. It'll also have some salts and some waste products. So remember that your skin is the largest organ of the body. It's one of the organs of elimination, even though it's not going to be your primary organ of elimination, like your rectum, the end of your digestive system, your kidneys and bladder, your lungs, all of those are part of the elimination process, but so is sweat because things are released through the sweat. So that's why you'll have some wastes through the skin and salts. Where salt goes, water goes. And so that's going to be what predominantly makes up your sweat. These particular glands respond to elevated body temperature. So when a person gets hot, the eccrine or merocrine glands are the ones that are producing that salty water that is going to then be deposited on the body surface through the pores to help you cool off. So eccrine or merocrine glands. Eccrine glands are going to be those that are present at birth. A baby, you notice that when there are newborns, even newborns, when they get warm, they'll have cute little beads of sweat on their forehead. Those are because the eccrine or merocrine glands are working and they are helping to cool the baby off. Excuse me. Apocrine glands. Apocrine glands are different different than the eccrine glands, obviously. Apocrine glands are located in your axillary region and your groin region. When we say axillary, we mean armpits. So pits and groin, and these open in onto the hair follicles. So you notice that eccrine glands open directly through pores, so not through hair follicles. I'm sorry, yeah, eccrine open through directly to the surface through pores, whereas apocrine glands will open up, will go to the surface through hair follicles, the openings that hair follicles go through. These are secreted by exocytosis. Exocytosis. So remember, exocytosis means that the cell is producing the product. The product is packaged in a vacuole. That vacuole, the membrane of the vacuole will be pretty much the same as the cell membrane. So when it's time to release that sweat from the cell membrane of the vacuole will then fuse with the membrane of the vacuole will fuse with the cell membrane. And as it fuses, then it opens up so that the vacuole now has an open end and the product can be spit out, saving the cell and saving the integrity of the cell. These apocrine glands will basically respond to emotions and pain. So these are not glands that are going to respond to temperature raises. If you have big emotions or you're in pain, that's when the apocrine glands are going to step in. Now, I was having trouble at one point remembering apocrine from ecrine, and one of my former students said that this is why little kids smell like apes. And I said, absolutely it is. Apocrine glands are going to be those that are activated on or around puberty. So when you have those little people, young people who are smell like they've been outside working a hard day's work, breaking bricks with their hands, uh, that is because their apocrine glands are starting to be activated. So, um, secreted by exocytosis, located in the armpits and the groin, and they open into hair follicles. Then you have specialized sweat glands. So specialized sweat is your earwax and the milk produced by the breast. These are actually, even though they are thicker than regular sweat, they're still basically modified sweat glands. So ceruminous glands produce cerumen, and cerumen is the name of earwax. And mammary glands, mammary refers to the breasts, so mammary glands produce milk. So here you see your apocrine gland, that coiled ball on one end, deep in the dermis subcutaneous area, with one end opening up through a duct into the hair shaft, the hair follicle, the whole of the hair follicle. So then that apocrine sweat will then be released from the same hole that hair is coming from. You have the sebaceous glands that are closely associated with the hair follicle, producing oil that will then be released through the hair shaft. And then you have your merocrine sweat glands that are also called coiled ball, that one end will form the duct that leads directly out through pores onto the skin surface. Make sure you're looking at the graph to give you a snapshot of what we just talked about. Functions of the skin. Functions of the skin. So skin is versatile. And in order to maintain balance in the body, it's imperative that your skin be intact and work the way it's supposed to work. So the functions of the skin include being a protective barrier, helping you with sensations, helping you with excretion, helping you produce vitamin D, and regulating your body temperature. So, as a protective barrier, it is basically going to be a shield that keeps harmful substances, UV radiation, microorganisms. You might hear me at some point call them bugs, but microorganisms from getting into the skin, and it protects the tissues deep to the skin from losing so much water to the atmosphere. It provides sensations by being the location that your sensory receptors are located. We already talked about your light touch and deep touch sensory receptors, one being more superficial, one being a little bit deeper, but both being in as a part of the skin. So the sensory receptors, you have sensory receptors for pressure, sensory receptors for temperature changes, and then you have neurons that basically tell you that you are in pain. All of those are going to be located in the skin to help you feel things. I already mentioned that the skin is the largest organ of elimination, so you will release some waste through the skin. And your body will release more waste through the skin if you're not eliminating properly through the other areas of excretion. So just make sure that you are excreting the way you're supposed to, and you won't have as much waste product coming through the skin. It's vital for vitamin D production. The production of vitamin D actually starts with the skin. You have uh, pre-vitamin D molecules floating around in your bloodstream, kind of hanging out close to the skin. And then as those UV lights hit the skin, those pre-vitamin D molecules will then start to be activated, go around into the float around into the rest of the body, and then be actually realized as vitamin D. So that vitamin D production, I should say, starts with the skin. This is why when um, you'll hear people when they're talking about having a person make vitamin D, that you should get sun exposure on the skin and get as much skin exposed to the sun as possible. So instead of wearing long sleeves outside, you might want to wear short sleeves, or if you can go shirtless or wear a tank top, you may want to do that, wear some shorts for at least a little while to help get more sun exposure, more surface area exposed to the sun so that your body can produce more vitamin D. And then it helps to regulate body temperature by having the air cool off the sweat that has been deposited on the skin. It also regulates body temperature by blood flow. So when we are hot, you notice that sometimes you can look flush. And when we say that somebody's looking flush, usually that means that their skin is red. The reason why their skin is red because of heat is because the blood vessels that are closer to the skin surface will dilate, meaning they'll open up. When they dilate, you allow more blood to flow through those vessels. And because they're close to the surface of the skin, that heat that is being transported in the blood is able to be released through the body surface. And between the increase in blood flow to the skin and the sweating, that heat will be absorbed by the sweat and then carried off when that sweat evaporates. And that helps to cool the body. If a body is warm, I'm sorry, if a body is cold, then those blood vessels that are closer to the surface are going to constrict or get smaller. So you decrease blood flow to the surface, increasing the blood flow to the internal organs to help keep them warm, as opposed to releasing heat with the environment. So regulation of body temperature can be if a person is cold or hot, the blood vessels on the surface of the skin will either constrict, get tighter, or dilate, get wider in order to affect how much heat is being released by the body. The reason why it's important for the body to regulate the heat loss, whether you are uh the ambient temperature is hot or cold, your body wants to regulate how much heat it's losing, because a slight shift in temperature can change how your body metabolizes. We already know that as things get warmer, reactions tend to get faster. As things get cooler, reactions tend to get slower. And so that same thing applies in our body. So if we cannot regulate our temperature, then we cannot regulate our body reactions, our metabolic reactions. Our bodies have a set point, basically a temperature that it tries to maintain at all times. And that set point is monitored by a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. So it's that set point, that narrow range of temperature set point that your body is striving toward, that if your temperature goes above or below that, that is going to trigger your body's either increased or decreased heat loss so that it can maintain that set point temperature. Deep body temperature stays close to the set point of 37 degrees Celsius, which is close to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or which is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. When we say deep body temperature, we mean like the core of the body, the inside of the body will maintain that body temperature more than the surface, of course, because the core is further away from the surface, so it's harder for the heat to be released. So it's able to maintain that temperature much better. The skin plays a role in homeostatic mechanisms that regulate body temperatures. Heat is a product of cellular metabolism. So as the cells are alive and they're doing just what they do, they're dividing, they're making product, they're making DNA, they're making ribosomes, etc., all the things that it's doing, it's going to produce heat as a byproduct. And that's part of what's helping to maintain this set point. And if we start doing extra things or the body temperature gets increased, that is what is going to shift how our bodies start to help regulate that heat. So that heat is going to be produced mainly by the most active cells, and your most active cells, your liver, your skeletal tissue, and your cardiac muscle. Those are going to be the cells that are always working and that are producing the most heat in the body, even though all of your cells that are alive are producing heat. So the ways that the body loses heat, there are four. These are, for many of you, these four, understanding the difference between these four is going to take a little bit of time. So make sure that you are sitting with it so that you understand it. And if it's still a little bit hard to understand, make sure that you are looking for online videos that explain the difference between the four to help you understand them better. So, four different types of heat loss. You have radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. Radiation is going to be the primary method of heat loss in the body. This is where infrared rays travel from warmer skin to a cooler environment. So think about when it is hot outside and you look over at the ground or you look over at a car and you, even though you don't see anything, like you don't see heat or smoke, or you don't see smoke, you can look and see kind of like these heat waves coming off the object. It's the same idea. Radiation will be where those heat rays, those infrared heat rays, will go from a warm surface to the cooler environment. All right, so that's radiation. Excuse me. Conduction, heat moves from the warmer skin to a cooler surface that it comes in contact with. This is why when you sit in a chair, you can usually tell when someone has been sitting in it, especially when they've just gotten up, because that chair will be warm from conduction. Like the heat leaves their body and goes to that object that they're in contact with. Then you have convection, heat loss from skin into circulating air currents. So we already saw the infrared rays, like when that is coming directly off the hot surface into the environment. But convection, the difference between that and convection is if you stand in front of a fan, for example, and the air is moving faster than the air in the environment, that air that's moving across your skin is going to then basically pull the heat away from your skin as well. And evaporation is due to heat loss through sweat as it evaporates. So the heat, as I mentioned earlier, the heat from the body, the heat from the blood vessels that have dilated close to the skin so that now you have more of that blood flow toward the skin surface. The heat that that blood is carrying can then be passed into the water from the sweat on the surface of the skin. And then as that sweat evaporates off the skin, it takes the heat away with it. So radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. Make sure you're spending some time to get those straight because they can be a little bit tricky for some people. All right. So when your body temperature raises, when your body temperature gets more hot, thermoreceptors, thermal meaning temperature, so temperature receptors will signal the hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus was the location that holds the body temperature set point. Um, Thermoreceptors will signal the hypothalamus that the body temperature has raised, has increased. That will then cause vasodilation of the dermal blood vessels, meaning vaso, vessel, blood vessel, dilation, widening. So widening of the blood vessels that are associated with the dermis, with the skin. You'll also have vasoconstriction. So constriction means tightening or, getting smaller of the blood vessels. So tightening of the blood vessels in those deeper vessels. So why is that? Well, if your body temperature is increasing, remember we said that the deep temperature, the deep core temperature of the body basically maintains a set point, basically maintains a set temperature because it doesn't give off heat very easily because it's deep, it's not close to the surface. Well, if your body temperature is going to raise, then those vessels on the inside, we want to constrict those a little bit so that we can then redirect more blood flow to the surface so that you have more of the heat leaving the blood through the skin, right? Evaporation, those four different heat loss methods, because now you have more blood flowing toward the skin. And as the heat rises, you'll have those sweat glands activated so that then you can also have that evaporation, right? If the body temperature falls, if the body gets too cold, then the thermal regulators in the hypothalamus are still signaled. But in this case, the signal basically is telling you that it's cold. So we're going to constrict the vessels that are closer to the skin and open the vessels that are deeper in the body so that now you're shunting more of that blood on the inside so that we can make sure that our vital organs are well heated and protected and we're not losing as much body heat because in colder temperatures, we want to maintain as much of that heat as possible. Our sweat glands are inactivated. We don't want to sweat. We don't want our water to evaporate. We don't want to lose heat, so the sweat glands are shut down. And muscles are contracted involuntarily, especially those, well, you have the erector pili muscles that are associated with your hair follicles. Those are going to contract. Those are going to help your hair stand on edge. When it helps your hair stand on edge, it is helping to hold heat into the body. So your body's still releasing some heat, but when your hair stand on edge, that heat is basically held on to a little bit longer and it provides a basically like a sheet of heat around the body in the hair. It also causes involuntary contraction of the skeletal muscles, and that's what's going to cause shivering. That shivering, those contractions are producing more heat so that now you can raise your own body temperature. look at this chart so that you can see basically what we just been talking about in a chart form for those, especially for those of you who are visual learners. If a person is having trouble maintaining their body temperature, they can experience what is called either hyperthermia or hypothermia. Remember, hyper means above or excess, high. Hypo means low. Thermia refers to temperature. Excuse me. So hyperthermia is excessive temperature, abnormally high body temperature. This can occur on a hot, humid day when your sweat can't evaporate. All right, when you're sweating, but the sweat is stuck to your skin, and it can't leave your skin. The reason why this happens is because the heat from your body, we already said that the blood vessels are gonna dilate. The dermal blood vessels are going to dilate, so now you have more blood flow toward the surface. Some of that heat is going to leave the blood vessels and go into the sweat, so that when the air passes across your skin, that sweat is evaporated into the air and takes the heat with it. Well, if the air is already humid, if the air is already saturated with water, right? Sometimes we go outside, especially being here in New Orleans, we go outside and you can almost feel the air because it's so thick and heavy with water. If that's the case, then when the air rushes across your skin, it can't pick up extra water from your skin because it's already full of water. So then the sweat can't evaporate and it stays on your body, which means that heat is going to stay on your body and help elevate your body temperature. When the air temperature is high, radiation is less effective. So we just talked about evaporation not being able to happen when there's humidity in the air. And now, if the temperature is too high, radiation can't even happen. So those infrared rays won't be able to leave the body surface and go into the ambient air, because then the air is too hot, much hotter than your body surface, so it can't leave to a cooler surface, cooler air, because the air is not cooler. All right. The body may gain heat from hotter air. So if the temperature is, excuse me, if the temperature is hot and it's extremely humid, the water that's in the air might raise your body temperature. Even if it's dry and the temperature is higher than your body, then instead of the heat radiating outward, the heat from the air will then make you hotter. In that case, the skin can become dry. The person can get weak because you're losing so much energy and heat. I'm sorry, you're losing so much energy because now you're so hot. A person can become dizzy, they can become nauseous, they can have headaches, and their pulse becomes extremely rapid. If someone is hypothermic, they have abnormally low body temperature. So hypo meaning low. So abnormally low body temperature. This can result from prolonged exposure to cold, or it can occur from illness. Shivering is going to be the result, one of the primary results. Shivering is an involuntary skeletal muscle contraction. So the muscles attached to your bones are contracting vigorously to create movement that's going to create heat that will produce heat for the body. At least that's the goal, to produce heat from the body. And this is caused by the hypothalamus, who again has a set point. And if that temperature gets below the set point, the hypothalamus sends signals to the skeletal muscles to contract, causing that shivering. If it continues to occur, if your body temperature continues to drop too low, the person can become confused, they can become lethargic, like get weak. So that weakness, that lethargy, can occur either with a very high or very low body temperature. You can lose your body reflexes. You start not being able to respond to stimuli, and you can potentially lose consciousness. If the person who is hypothermic doesn't get treatment, the organs will eventually shut down. All right. Elevated body temperature. This is another of the clinical applications that you should probably be familiar with. So loss of the ability of homeostatic temperature control mechanism to function in an extremely hot environment. So this is what we're talking about, elevated body temperature. Exposure to high heat or very high heat can overwhelm the temperature control mechanisms of the body, and that will lead to hyperthermia. If the heat in the body builds up faster than the heat can be released from the body, then that body temperature will continue to rise because the body is holding on to more heat than it wants to. And even if the set point is still where it's supposed to be, the body temperature will rise because you literally cannot get rid of the heat. Then you'll have that extreme vasodilation. Remember, dilation is opening, so vessel opening, vessel widening, can collapse the cardiovascular system. And this can be fatal. So when the temperatures get very high, the body is desperately trying to get rid of some of that heat. It's going to open up those blood vessels. But if too many blood vessels open up too soon, you still have the same amount of blood, then your blood pressure will get much lower because you don't have enough blood to fill up the widened spaces in the blood vessels. And that is what can be fatal. That's what can kill a person. Fever. Fever is you have a set point elevated by your immune system. So if your body has an infection, if your body has an infection, your immune system is going to take that set point and elevate it and increase it so that your body temperature can raise without having too much heat loss. Because at this point, you want to maintain a higher temperature within the body. This is going to help you fight the infection. Because of that elevated temperature, your phagocytes, the cells that eat up and gobble up things, will release pyrogens. Remember, pyro means fire or heat. So pyrogens are going to be chemicals that the phagocytes release in response to the presence of bacteria or viruses. The hypothalamus then is going to increase that set point so that the body temperature will increase. So phagocytes will recognize that there are invaders in the area. The phagocytes, they'll be able to gobble up the bacterial viruses, but in response, it's going to release these chemicals that are going to help to increase the body's set point so that the temperature of the body can increase. And like I said, that elevated temperature is part of the body's response or the part of the body's way of destroying or getting rid of pathogens, organisms that want to cause disease. All right, inflammation. Inflammation is a process that the body absolutely wants to happen. I know that in everyday speak, usually you hear about people taking anti-inflammatories because they want to stop the inflammatory process, but know that inflammation is desired. Whenever you have damage, there's inflammation that helps to heal the area, right? So inflammation is a normal response to injury or stress. It is the body's attempt to restrict the spread of infection and to heal tissues. So what happens is the blood vessels in whatever area is being affected, those blood vessels are going to dilate. Remember, dilation is to open or to widen so that they also become more permeable. Permeability refers to substances' ability to go across a membrane. So substances are able to leave the blood vessels and go into the surrounding tissues as the blood vessels get bigger. So the more permeable that blood vessel becomes, the more fluid can leave the blood vessels and then go into the surrounding tissue of the damaged area. Those surrounding, fluids that leak into that area will then contain materials that will help the body heal that area. So that inflamed area, that inflamed skin will become reddened because of the increased blood flow due to the vasodilation. The, the area will become swollen because of the increased fluid that leaked into the area. It will become warm because of the increased blood flow to the area. And the area can become painful because you now have more fluid in an area that typically didn't have it before, along with all those cells being activated to do the job that it's now trying to do. So if you have a cut, whether you have a shallow cut or a deeper cut, the body will respond slightly differently because different areas of the body have been affected. Excuse me. So with a shallow cut, usually a shallow cut only affects the epidermis. Think paper cut, all right? Only affecting the epidermis. This results in epidermal cells along the margin of the cut dividing more rapidly than usual to help fill in those spaces. So you get a really shallow cut, like I said, a paper cut. You oftentimes don't know it. It's not bleeding. Remember, the epidermis does not have its own it typically doesn't have its own blood supply, does not have its own blood supply. So remember, you see, it does not say that there is any bleeding. Um, so yeah, shallow cut affects only the epidermis. Those cells will, at the margins of the cut will divide more rapidly to help fill in those spaces. If you have a deeper cut, a cut that goes into the dermis or the subcutaneous or hypodermic layer, those will result in bleeding from broken blood vessels. Remember, shallow cut, we didn't have bleeding because it only affected the epidermis, and the epidermis is avascular. So with a deeper cut affecting or breaking your blood vessels, you're going to have blood released into those areas. And as the blood is being released, eventually the platelets and other factors will go in and start to form a clot. A clot is made up of a chemical called fibrin. It's made up of blood cells and is made up of platelets. So platelets are going to be what starts forming the clot. Fibrin is going to be a protein, like a protein fiber, that's going to help pull things together. Then the blood cells are just going to be located inside of it. That's going to help to create part of that clot. That clot will then dry. That's what we call a scab. Those epithelial cells will reproduce to fill in the wound, just like with a shallow cut. Then you'll have fibroblasts that will secrete collagen fibers into the area to help bind the wound together. So you have the epithelial cells on the surface reproducing to fill in the wound at the epithelial layer. Then you have the fibroblasts that are secreting collagen fibers deeper to the epithelium. So in that connective tissue layer, that's going to secrete collagen fibers to help bind the wound in that area. Excuse me. Growth factors will then stimulate new tissue formation to help heal those tissues, help continue to heal those tissues. Phagocytic cells, the cells that go in and gobble things up, they will go in, gobble up all the dead cells from, where you were cut, the cells that were damaged and died, debris, so cell parts, tissue parts that weren't supposed to be in the area. For example, if you were cut by something wooden, you might have wood debris, there might be dirt in the area, the phagocytes can go in and gobble up that debris. And eventually, as the wound ages, that scab will slough off and fall off. If there is excess collagen fiber being deposited in the area, then we might get a scar. So if it's not as much damage, you won't have as much collagen fibers being deposited in the area, and you may not produce a scar. So this is a pictograph of what we're talking about. So now you have a wound. So it looks like something jabbed this person's skin past the epidermal layer into the dermis. So you see that it is red from the increased blood flow into the area. These blood vessels have been damaged, and so you have blood flow, that blood that fills up this space. This blood is going to have your fibrinogen, you know it's going to have your blood cells, and has the platelets. On the surface where it's close to the air, it's going to form that clot so that you're not losing as much blood from the vessels that are still broken. You will have these macrophages and fibroblasts and other white blood cells that are going into the area, leaving the blood vessels, going into the area, so that it starts to clean up the debris. It starts to heal the wound from, the heals all the wound. Fibroblasts are going to secrete those collagen fibers that are going to repair the the dermal layer. And then you form a scab. You eventually form a scab over the area that over time will fall off. And if the damage is big enough, and you produce enough collagen fibers, then you will have a scar or fibrosis. So osis meaning a condition of having lots of fibers in the area. So that fibrosis, that skin is now not, is going to be different from the way it was originally, because it's going to be more fibrous than it was previously. Let's talk about burns. So burns are classified by how much tissue is damaged during the burn. You have superficial burns, deep partial thickness burns, deep full thickness burns, right? So partial thickness burn is called a first degree burn. This burn only affects the epidermis. So if you've ever had a sunburn, if you've got burned from, say, heat from a stove, not a stove, from like heat from the oven, it's going to cause redness, it's going to cause inflammation, but it'll usually heal within a few days, and there's not going to be scarring. So first degree burns only go as deep as the epidermis. And there's no scarring. It heals really quickly. Deep partial thickness burns are your second degree burns, and they destroy the epidermis and some of the dermis. So it goes a little bit deeper than your first degree. So if you were, had some kind of hot liquid jumped on your skin, that's usually going to cause something like a second degree burn. When you get a second degree burn, you know that it's second degree because then you typically have blisters. So if you burn and it causes a blister, that's a second degree burn because you've burned not only the epidermis, but also parts of the dermis. The healing varies depending on how bad the burn is and how many of those stem cells that are associated with the skin survive the burn. Stem cells in the hair follicles and the glands can help regenerate the skin if those stem cells have not been damaged too much. Usually a person will have complete healing. You won't have any scarring because in these partial thickness second degree burns, you usually don't have too much damage, so the stem cells can go in and heal the area. Full thickness third degree burns you destroy both the epidermis and the dermis and some of the accessory structures. Remember, accessory structures are your hair, your nails, your sweat and oil glands. Those are considered the accessory structures. And in these full thickness burns, your accessory structures can get damaged. This usually results from a prolonged exposure to heat or some hot substance. Some of the some healing from the margins will occur, but oftentimes when a person has a third-degree burn, they need a skin graft or some other type of graft that will help to regenerate their skin because so much of the skin is destroyed. There's actually also a fourth degree burn that I wanted you to know about. Fourth degree burns are also full thickness burns, and usually fourth degree burns go from the epidermis down to the bone. So you'll then have damaged, burned, charred muscle and bone with fourth degree burns. So it's much, much deeper and much more serious. When you have patients that have been burned, physicians, medical staff use the rule of nines to determine how much of the body surface has been burned. So when you hear people say they've been burned on 95% of their body, on 20% of their body, this is how they come up with those numbers. They use the rule of nines. So it divides the body surface into regions of 9% or multiples of nine. It's used to estimate the extent of injury from on the body surface from a burn so that we can know what we're dealing with for burn treatment. From this estimate, um, they can determine how much fluid to replace. Because remember, when the skin is burned, it's being destroyed. And part of the skin's functioning is to protect against heat loss. So if the skin has been burned away, and now you have those deeper tissues, the muscles, the connective tissue, the bone, exposed to the air, you can release more fluid and become dehydrated much more easily. So then the medical staff have to plan for the replacement of those fluids and those electrolytes so that you don't die of dehydration while you're being treated for your burns. And they can also determine how much skin needs to be replaced if the skin needs to be replaced. So here is what it looks like, the rule of nines. So the head, the anterior portion of the head and neck is considered 4.5%. The posterior portion of the head and neck are considered 4.5%. So put together, the anterior portion and posterior portion of the head is 9%. So if the head, anterior, and posterior portions are burned, then that's 9% of the body being burned. The posterior trunk is 18%, so 9 and 9. The anterior trunk is 9 and 9, so that's 18% of the body. The anterior upper arms are 9%, posterior, I'm sorry, 4.5%. The posterior upper arms, 4.5%. So posterior of both sides are 9, anterior of both sides, 9. And then each leg posterior is 9, anterior is 9. Right, so if it's anterior of both legs, it's 18%, and posterior of both leg is 18%. And then the final 1% is the groin area. So together that is 100% of the body. And so depending on how much of each portion of the body, they can quickly assess how much of the body has been affected by burns. And this is just telling us how the skin and the integumentary system changes over time as we get older. So as we get older, all of the cell cycles will tend to slow down. Because the cell cycles slow down, the skin is not reproducing as rapidly as it once did. That can cause those cells that are now older to start to look more scaly. You start to see more spots. The epidermis and dermis become thinner because you're not getting as much cellular exchange. or cell production of things like those collagen fibers, elastic fibers, etc. You start to lose fat from that subcutaneous layer. So now your skin is not as plump, and that can also lead to more wrinkles. It will also lead to a person feeling more cold because they don't have that layer of insulation. So sometimes you'll talk to elders, and your elders are always cold. And part of that reason is because they've lost so much of that subcutaneous layer due to aging. Again, the thinning of the dermis and the epidermis and the loss of the subcutaneous layer, that will all lead to wrinkling and sagging of the skin because it's not as tight. Your sebaceous glands, the oil producing glands, will secrete less oil, and the skin, that will make the skin more dry, and that will also lead to wrinkling and sagging. Your melanin production starts to slow down. And so your melanin production in the skin and the hair starts to slow down. That's why there's gray hair. The hair itself will start to become thinner. You'll decrease the number of hair follicles that occur. Your nail growth will decrease. Your sensory receptors will be less sensitive. So this is why elders won't always know how hot or how cold it is in an area. So when it becomes excessively hot outside, you hear commercials saying, go check on your neighbors, go check on your elders. The reason is because their bodies are not registering the changes in temperatures as readily as it used to, so they won't realize how hot it is, and they can succumb to that excessive heat. Their body temperature regulation will also become less effective, so they're already not realizing how hot it is, but also now they can't regulate their body temperature as well, so that will also help them to possibly become hyperthermic when the temperatures become too high, or hypothermic when it becomes too low. And they have less of the ability to produce their own vitamin D, which can cause a whole host of other issues. So this is younger skin, this is older skin. We see in older skin that deep wrinkling of the skin. We see that lack of melanin production in the hair shaft. We can see that in younger skin, the dermis, you have hyaluron and water, you have your elastic fibers, you have your collagen fibers. They're plentiful, they're thick, they're robust, and they're holding everything together. And as you grow older, those things start become thinner and they start becoming less abundant, and that also helps to create more wrinkles in the body. The hypodermis or the adipose tissue will also start to thin, and that will help create wrinkles and sagging skin. So another image of the skin, we see this stratum basale, right? This single layer of cells that are close to a basement membrane. We don't see the basement membrane, but we know it's there because we know what epidermal tissue looks like, or epithelial tissue looks like, which makes up the epidermis. Your melanocytes are going to be located in that stratum basale. And here it's an abundance of melanocytes. So this is dark skin. This is brown skin. Superficial to that, you have your stratum spinosum. Superficial to that, you have your stratum granulosum. Here you have stratum lucidum. This is where stratum lucidum will be if this is thick skin, which this is not, because you don't have brown, well, let me not say that. Anyway, the stratum lucidum will be here if you have thick skin, if this is thick skin, and then the stratum corneum, the keratinized dead cells that create the surface of the skin. Excuse me, and deep to all of these structures, this is the dermis, and we know this is dermis because it looks very different from the epidermis. Same thing, so this is thick skin. All right, This is thin skin. So they're talking about stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum is not going to be here in thin skin, but this is where it would be located if it were here. Stratum lucidum definitely is here. So this is the stratum lucidum. You see how it looks slightly different from the stratum granulosum versus the stratum corneum. Stratum corneum is going to be much thicker. So this will either be the palms or the soles. And you have these ridges. These ridges are that dermal papillae that create your fingerprints, your palm prints. And that is it for chapter 6.